Well, greetings, everyone, and welcome to God's Unchanging Word in this week's edition of News, Nuggets, and Insights. Today is Friday, March the 3rd, just 1 month away from Passover and the Days of Unleavened Bread, which we'll be talking a lot about toward the middle and the end of this month to try to help everyone get ready, prepare for God's spring holy days. Today I want to talk about something that's permeating the nation and around the world that we're not really paying a lot of attention to in many cases, especially if someone is not in the church. It's the rise of anti. And the anti what? Pretty much the rise of anti anything that brings us to the biblical principles of God's holy word. We're seeing the rise in anti-law, the rise in anti-establishment, the rise in what's going on most recently is anti-Semitism that's gaining ground around the world. What's interesting about this is that whenever God seems to have, as they would call in the stock market, in play, when God begins to move or begins to move to his next stage or his plan for salvation, it seems that Satan's always there and begins to rise up and to try to trounce what God is about to do. And as we get closer to the return of Jesus Christ, where he's actually going to return to this earth, where his feet are going to stand on the Mount of Olives, that infuriates the evil world. And so what we're beginning to see right now is the rise of anti-Semitism. I've got a quote up here that's out of Germany. It's talking about a rise of anti-Semitism of 16% in Berlin. It says, with a new report noting that rise in anti-Semitic incidences in Berlin, Jewish leaders in the German capital renewed their call for a federal commission to deal with the problem. And it's not just in Germany. It's all across Europe, it's across the world, and it's here in the United States. Here recently, it's a report from the U.S. bishops of all places talking about the rise in anti-Semitism and denouncing the recent attacks. In Washington, D.C., February 27th, just a few days ago, U.S. bishops state that they're responding with solidarity and concern for the Jewish community following a surge of anti-Semitic actions in recent weeks, including vandalism, desecration, and bomb threats. And bomb threats is on a rise here in America. And these are something that has to be taken seriously because lives are at stake. Today, I want to talk about something in focus with anti that we wouldn't think about ordinarily, but it seems to be the news of the week. So see if this doesn't sound familiar. Fake news seems to be on everybody's mind today. So we're going to focus today on fake news in light of what the Bible has to say and see what kind of nuggets God has for us in this. Remember growing up when you see this liar, liar, pants on fire? When you was a kid, everybody used to talk about liar, liar, pants on fire. Well, I believe Ronald Reagan also used that phrase in one of his speeches. But I want to bring out two quotes that he had which relates to what's going on today. First one is this. It isn't so much that liberals are ignorant, it's just that they know so many things that aren't so. So when you see what's going on, I thought that was kind of ironic because of the media and the way things are being slanted and twisted today, which is a perversion of the truth. Now, just so everybody else doesn't think they're going to get off the hook, he also says this. Now, watch this. It isn't so much what we don't know that hurt us, it is what we know that isn't true. All right, so it's what we know that isn't true. All right, so in these two quotes, he's got everybody. All right, he's covered everybody. So what does the Bible say? When we talk about fake news, the first thing that comes to mind, it's a scripture in one of God's commandments. It says this, in Exodus 20, verse 16, he says, "You shall not bear false witness against thy neighbor." All right, well, that's pretty simple. False witness, as some translation says, thou shalt not lie. So we hear fake news, we say, well, these people are lying. All right, so, but is that where it stops? So what I want to share with you today is some insight from God's holy word that talks about a condition we're facing in America today that's detrimental to the health, the safety, and the well-being of God's people. Now, look what it says in the book of Hosea, chapter 4 and verse 6. My people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge, because it says, because you have rejected knowledge, I will also reject you, that you shall be no priest to me, seeing that you have forgotten the law of your God. Now, believe it or not, in paraphrase, what Ronald Reagan said is what we know that isn't true that can hurt us. That's what this is telling us. God's saying, because you've rejected the truth, the damage that's going to come because of your rejection is going to be impacting on your generations. Because here's what he says, I will also forget your children. Some translations say forsake. So that means that God's got a hands-off policy. And so if you want to protect your children, well, we need to be in God's protection. But it means more than just our children, because it goes on. Look what it says in Exodus 34, verse 7. Keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, and that will in no means clear the guilty. In other words, God will forgive people when they do things wrong because of his mercy and his protection. He said, but the guilty is not going to go unpunished. Visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children and upon the children's children unto the third and the fourth generation. So now, let me back up again before I go a little further. What are we looking at here? Now, let's put this in perspective of today. When we go back 3 and 4 generations now, we go back into the time of the 60s when people began removing God as their foundation of the bulwark of America, we began to see from generation to generation the perversity of the way we live getting worse and worse and worse. So what God's saying is, because you have done this, the living laws of God that are in place is that you can't pass on the truth that brings blessings to the next generation unless you're obedient to those blessings that God says that brings them. So as each generation moves away from God, it continues to move into the corruption of what we're seeing today. So now, that brings us to the point. In Genesis 6, now keep this in mind, Genesis 6, and we're going to come back to that in just a few minutes. In Deuteronomy 19, verses 15 through 20, what we're looking at is a progression of evil that comes upon a society when they do what? When they bear false witness. All right, so now let me go through and I'm going to read this and I'm going to bring out several points that are much deeper than just telling a lie, like liar, liar, pants on fire. So in verse 15 we begin. One witness shall not rise against a man concerning any iniquity or any sin that he commits, but by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses the matter shall be established. All right, let's stop for a second. How does the news media deal with news? Well, they say they have sources that gives them the information. Those sources are supposed to be corroborated with at least 2 sources or more. But here's the problem. Those sources are always kept secret. In God's holy word, if you're going to balance the scale for what's right for society and keep things on the level, you cannot bring a false witness or bring a witness against someone without the testimony of at least 2 people. That means the entire pretense on how the news media is established for reporting its information is built on a principle that violates God's law. So in other words, the news can say whatever they want to say. They don't have to have any backing. They simply have to say, well, we have a source that told us this. In other words, there could be someone who comes and lies against another person to bring about harm. Now, this is what this is talking about, and I'm going to show you why this is so dangerous according to the Hebrew word that's in these verses. Look at verse 16. If a false witness rises against any man to testify against him of his wrongdoing, then both men in the controversy shall stand before the Lord and before the priest and the judges who serve in those days. According to verse 17, if the news media is going to report an evil, they have to be able to bring their witnesses to go testify in court to prove what they're saying. See, there's accountability here that what God's showing. That way people simply can't lie against one another for their own personal gain. which is what's going on in this nation today. And it's becoming more and more violent in its concept. Let me show you. That's exactly what God warns in these verses, whether we realize it or not. So let's show you. The word false, all right? The word false. The word false comes from Strong's number 2555, which says chamak. Now, what does that mean? What does chamak mean? Now, let's go to Genesis 6, verse 11, and let's try to explain what that word means. Genesis 6, verse 11 says this, "And the earth was corrupt before the Lord, and the earth was filled with violence." All right, now, in the previous slide, I just showed you, and I circled false, right? We circled false. It has the exact same word is being used in this sentence. All right, so if you were going to look at this sentence, what would be the word number 2555, shamak, in this sentence? All right. So let's look at that. Which word is translated from 2555 as false in the previous verse to today? Violence. All right, so what God's saying, if you're bringing a false report in the nature in which this is being brought about, all right, this is more than just telling a lie. This is being brought about to bring harm on an individual or a society. So let's look at that again now. I'm back in the same chapter. We just read 15, we read 16, and we read 17. All right. So now let's look at that, and look what it says here in verse 15. "One witness shall not rise against a man concerning any iniquity or sin that he commits." So when you talk about bringing about a false witness, you're doing a couple things. You're imputing motive. You have judged that individual, which God says we're not allowed to do. You've brought about an action that he may not have done, to talk about bringing that person to court, to prison, or possibly to be even executed. All right, so the word false in this brings out a deeper meaning than just lying. The word, it's telling us here in the society that if you do this and we allow this as a society, what we're doing is allowing corruption to raise up and violence will be brought about. When we read in Genesis in 6, when it talked about the violence that was upon the earth, that was at the end stage before the time where God had brought an end to all mankind except Noah and his family. In other words, what God's showing us here, that God said to Moses to tell the people, if you allow this type of evil to exist in your society, it's going to bring about an evil and violence that you will never be able to stop. All right, so that's what's going on. And today, the rise of anti. So what happens here? When we see Donald Trump right now, when he speaks out against false narratives, against the way things are being brought about that are not true, what are we seeing? A rise against what God says the way things ought to be. It's the rise of an anti-godly establishment. Now, let's go on to finish these verses out. "And the judges shall make careful inquiry, and indeed, and if the witness is a false witness who testified falsely against his brother, then you shall do to him as he thought to have done to his brother, and so you shall put away evil from among you." Now let's put this in perspective. Let me tell you what we just read here. If the news media, who would bring about all this information, if they were held accountable to the Word of God, they'd have to bring a witness to testify in court. Then the things would have to be laid out. And it has to be at least 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses. It can't be 1. And if the person they found out who brought these accusations, if the news media had to be held accountable for their stories, and they found that they were liars, then they would receive the punishment upon which they were trying to bring to the other person. Do you think that we would have the problems in our society today if we held to the standard what God just showed us here? No, absolutely not. If we simply just held the news media accountable for what they say, If there was a penalty that was being put upon someone for reporting false information, for telling the lies, or trying to create the corruption, then we wouldn't have the problems that we have today. And then verse 20, look what God says. And those who remain shall hear and fear, and hereafter they shall not again commit such evil among you. You see what God's telling us? If you do what I'm telling you to do, if you hold accountable the people who try to create the lies, who twist and pervert justice and evil, and try to destroy an opposing party, political view or not, doesn't matter, all the way down to the personal level, God says you will drive that evil out of your land. It's not complicated. But had we not, because we have not obeyed the laws of God, we live with the turmoil that we have today, and violence is escalating at levels we have not seen since the 60s. Now, let's go on. Exodus 20, verse 16. Now, this is where I read earlier, Exodus 20, 16, and it says, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. So I got false under very large lettering. Okay, so now, that word false actually comes from a different word. All right, that word comes from number 8266 in Strong's, which means to deal falsely, to lie, or say something that's untrue. So if you're doing something that's untrue, God's saying you're going to pay a price for it because that's committing sin. All right? But it doesn't hold the depth of what was going on in that other verse where it's talking about rising up and moving in a nation to create evil and injustice and bring about evil and violence for where we're going through. Now, in Deuteronomy 19:16, where we were, that word comes from, we just covered it, 25:55. So you notice there's two different words that also are translated as false. So what God's showing us here, that there's deeper depths of when a person lies, to the point of intentionally trying to destroy another, a business, a person, a family, a society, going on through lies and through deception. Sorry, so there we have Deuteronomy 19, verse 16, with false. In the deepest sense, Shemak means the disruption of divinely established order of things, and it means that wrong has not been righted, that the guilt lies on the entire populace, thus disrupting their relationship with God and interfering with God's blessings. That's the depth of what we're talking about when we allow these things to take place. So what God's telling us when we see all of this, if a society accepts this and allows it to take place, what you have done is you have brought evil into your society, you have removed God, thus the nation cannot be blessed. And because it isn't blessed, what happens next is evil begins to penetrate into its every facet of life. Well, I'm going to tell you something. That's what we're witnessing right now across our nation. It's more than just fake news. It's the detriment of our society and the peace upon which we're trying to live. There's another word for false. The third word says this. It's found in Exodus 23, verses 1 through 3. And it's talk about judging or participating in an evil. As we just read, that one of the definitions of Shemak 25:55 was allowing an entire society to let it go on. Now, this is talking about if you participate in this type of system of judgment. Verse 1, you shall not circulate a false report. Do not put your hand with the wicked to be a false witness. All right, this word false here comes from another word, number 7723, which is shav, means lying, deception, or falsely. It says, verse 2, you shall not follow a crowd to do evil, nor shall you testify in a dispute as to turn aside after many to pervert or distort justice, in verse 3. And you shall not show impartiality to a poor man in his dispute. So what God's telling us here, that it is possible that people will lie to create a mob mentality, which we see all the time going on right now, to create evil. And from that evil, what does it go to? Violence. disruption and violence in the society, and we're seeing that through these the anti-demonstrations, the anti-movements against God, the anti where you begin to see burning, looting, and people being injured. And eventually people are going to be dying if this thing doesn't stop and stay in check. And finally, it says that we're not to show partiality, especially to a poor man in his dispute. In other words, you start taking advantage of people, you're going to pay a price to God. So now we have three different words for showing it's more than just lying. It's talking about intent, and it's participating in an evil that rises up the mob mentality, which allows violence to permeate our society. It's more than just fake news. It's dangerous news when you allow these things, and God says He's going to hold the whole society accountable. And that's why I'm bringing this out today. It's important that we as God's people understand the very nature and the principle of the lie from all its ingredients, from the very simplest liar, liar, pants on fire, to the point of bringing down a society where people who will use lies and falsehoods to destroy one another and the nature upon which we live in this country. Verse 6, it goes on to say, you shall not pervert, all right, pervert or distort, as some translations say, the judgment, which is justice, of your poor in your dispute. You shall keep yourself far from a false matter. So if you begin to hear someone say, hey, listen, I heard about this, rumors, hearsay, God says you don't hear any of that until you have at least 2 or 3 witnesses. In fact, in the New Testament, Jesus Christ is very adamant about following those principles, whereas we're not to be involved in rumors, period. All right? It says, do not kill the innocent and righteous, for I will not justify the wicked. You shall take no bribe, for a bribe blinds the discerning and perverts the words of the righteous. And many people today, they will know something's corrupt, but they will be paid off just to turn the head the other way and allow that injustice to take place for personal gain. And what God says is a bribe blinds the discerning and perverts the words of the righteous. It says also, you shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the heart of a stranger, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And a stranger who comes in, people take advantage of because they're innocent. They're trying to do what is right, and someone just overpowers them and destroys those people and any hope and future that they may have. Well, before I go on to this next one, let me back this up here. Let me wrap this up. It's funny to hear some of the stories that are being told today about the false fake news. But it's detrimental to our society, and we need to realize that this has got to stop. And the more someone tries to stop that, you're going to see more and more the rise of evil to destroy those who try to follow the very basic principles of God's holy word. All right, so now let's begin to wrap it up. We just mailed out this month's news letter, and it's preparing us now for Passover. I love the little cartoon caption here, but let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of that bread and drink of that cup. And it's so cute. You see this cat looking in the mirror and sees himself as a roaring lion. And so when we come before God's throne, He wants us to be able to examine ourselves and come before Him openly as we are. Also, we have the card that went out with the newsletter. If you don't have either of these, please go to the website and sign up. We send out a monthly newsletter every month. We offer a free DVD, and this one coming up is The Death of Our Moral Compass that just went out, and that's for March. Now, our February DVD offering is out. Jehoshaphat, Part 1. Did that go out yet? It went out Monday. So if you, it's going out this coming Monday. It's going out this coming Monday. So if you haven't requested your first part of Jehoshaphat, King of Judah, please do so and get it in time. We'll send it out to you by Monday. And we're focusing on 2 Chronicles chapter 20. It is also the first of a 3-part series. Part 2 will go out 2 weeks later, and then Part 3 will follow 2 weeks after that. Part 2 is changing of the culture of a nation. And I talk a lot about what we're going through today. We tie in the reign of King Jehoshaphat to what's going on in America today. You're going to be absolutely fascinated by what God has recorded there and how the pattern of what we're going through today is just like, it's like a glove that just fits over the timing of King Jehoshaphat. So if we want to turn our nation around, we need to go back to see what Jehoshaphat did in his time as king of Judah. And then the last one will be on deception, which takes on a more personal nature for you and I in the timing of what we're going through in our lives in America today. Also mailed out this past week is Today, If You Hear His Voice, Chapter 4. It is the last of a four-part series in the duality of events tying in Today, If You Hear God's Voice. It's a really powerful series. They should be all online by now. If not, they'll be online within the next week or so. So you can watch them online also, or write in and get your own copy. We did something a couple weeks ago. We were talking about the judicial system in light of Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah. And we actually did a full 1 hour program in News Nuggets and Insights that's available online. We're also mailing it out. We called that series for News Nuggets and Insights, The Constitution, Freedom, and the Courts. And we were showing how the rise of the anti, as we're talking about today, how the court systems now, they're getting around the Constitution and the Supreme Court, and they're flanking to be able to do what they want to do from a local level or a regional level, which bypasses the protection of the Constitution for you and I. It's a really important message. You really need to see that if you haven't seen it yet. You can go online for News Nuggets and Insights and you can find it. You can watch it there or write in and we'll be glad to send it to you. A full 1 hour program, Constitution, Freedom, and the Courts. The March DVD offering, which we just talked about, The Death of Our Moral Compass. If you don't have it, write in. We'll get that to you. And so that's it. That's it for News Nuggets and Insights this week. Thank you again for watching. God willing, you have a great Sabbath, and we'll see you again next week, same place. God's Unchanging Word, News Nuggets and Insights. Till then, God be with you.